I thought it would be helpful for me to kind of do a quick overview of the Tudors. And I just encourage you to watch this video to the very end, and hopefully, this provides a little bit of clarity on maybe some of the finer details that may have gotten jumbled in your research. So, Henry VII was the first Tudor king. He won it through war. He basically was the one who ends the War of the Roses, which was a very drawn out war between two families, the Lancasters and Yorks. He is the founder of the Tudor dynasty because he won his throne through battle, and he was able to make England a stronger country, let's say, because he got his son married to the Spanish princess, and Spain was like the country at the time of the most power. And so, by England being united with Spain, he ends up showing the world that England is now a real country. He brought stability to England by ending the War of the Roses and uniting the houses of Lancaster and York through his marriage, because he did end up marrying Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York was Henry VII's wife and Henry VIII's mother. She was born February 11th and then died on her birthday in 1503. She was the daughter of King Edward IV and niece to Richard III. Edward IV died. Richard took over, even though he really wasn't supposed to, because she did have two brothers. They were known as the Princes in the Tower because Richard III basically imprisoned his nephews. They were very young, and he argued it was for their protection, but they disappeared. And historically speaking, a lot of people do blame Richard for their death. Some people say that they were murdered. Some people say they died of sickness, but he didn't want to admit that they had been sick in the tower. Whatever it is, I think in the 1800s, two bodies of, or two skeletons, I should say, of two young boys were found in the Tower of London, and they were transferred to Westminster Abbey, where they are buried as the princes in the tower. And it is assumed that they were the hidden, murdered bodies of Elizabeth of York's brothers. Her mother was known as a witch and was feared for her powers. There's a lot of backstory there, but I'll keep it short. Elizabeth, her legacy, it's really important because her marriage to Henry VII ends up basically ending the War of the Roses. Her children are the bloodline combined of Lancaster and York, so there is no more need for war between the two families because her children had both bloodlines through them and were therefore the rightful kings of England. Her youngest son, Henry VIII, was the first ruler of the House of Tudor to actually inherit the throne. He ended up fighting three different wars with France because he wanted to be like his father and be like this great military leader. But honestly, like he wasn't as successful because there just wasn't a need for it. He did end up winning the Battle of Flodden over Scotland in 1513. And again, his legacy is that he was the first Tudor king to actually inherit the throne. So he's starting like the consistency of the dynasty. No one's going to fight him or say that he's like not supposed to be on the throne. But he was the second son of Henry VII. His elder brother Arthur was supposed to be king, but Arthur ended up dying very young. Arthur had been married to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess that Henry VII basically got, his son to marry. And she is the one who actually led the English in a successful war against Scotland. Both of her parents were great military leaders, and so she took after them. And while Henry was over in France fighting a war that he basically was just being, told, "Oh, you're doing so great," but he really wasn't. Catherine actually did lead the English in a successful war against Scotland. She served as regent, basically ruling England when her husband was fighting off in France, and England was very successful under her reign. She was a very devout Catholic from Spain. So she and Henry both were devout Catholics, and their religion did tie them together. She was wife number one as a legacy, and then her only surviving child, Mary, became Queen of England and ruled as a Catholic queen, trying to follow in her mother's footsteps. Then we get to Anne Boleyn, the lady who broke everyone up. We don't know when Anne Boleyn was born. Our best guess is 1507. No one really wrote it down. She was beheaded on May 19th, 1536. She honestly, it's hard to tell with her. There's a lot of people who wrote nasty stuff about her, and it's because they didn't really like her. She was very unpopular in court. Apparently, she came across as arrogant, but she was incredibly intelligent and very passionate about education and equality in a lot of different ways. She had several miscarriages, unfortunately, but she did give birth to a daughter named Elizabeth, but she never gave Henry what he wanted, which was a son. Eventually, he got tired of her and basically couldn't divorce her because he divorced Catherine and created the whole church, right? So, he couldn't divorce her. So instead, what he did was he accused her of heresy and of being a witch, and then he chopped off her head and married wife number 3 the same day. So she was wife number 2, and her life led to Henry divorcing Catherine and creating the Church of England, which today is known as the Anglican Church. Then we get to number 3, Jane Seymour. She was Henry VIII's favorite wife, known for being very kind. Inadvertently or not, she did help bring around Anne Boleyn's downfall and execution because, she's wife number 3, so obviously you need to get rid of wife number 2. She was the only one of Henry's wives to give him a son, and I really should have put a living son. Catherine and Anne both did have sons, but they died very early on, so or they never quite made it to the full 9 months. So Jane Seymour, though, did give him a living son and ended up dying from childbirth. She brought all of Henry's children back to court, though, and she created the idea of a family. She was very firm in that Henry, Mary, and Elizabeth should have a relationship. And so she is responsible for creating that family sense between Henry and his 2 daughters. Anne of Cleves, the one who looked like Henry's horse. All right, so she married Henry VIII to create ties between England and the Lutherans because England at this point had its own church, and they needed support against the Catholic Church that was still attacking them. Henry VIII really fell in love with her portrait. We really could refer to this as like the first written case of catfishing because the person who did her portrait tried to make her look very pretty, and apparently she just didn't quite hold up. She was divorced and she was given a very large income, and she lived in Richmond, England until she died. Basically, her legacy that we know her for is that she was married to form this political alliance, but it fails because he was not pleased with her. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, the youngest of the wives. She was not wife material for a king, especially at the time. She had a lot of affairs before her marriage to Henry VIII, but he found her inspiring because she was young and pretty, and she loved partying, and so he was like trying to like get this like second wind in his life. She ended up cheating on him with his servant and Thomas Culpeper, and she was beheaded for that because you can't sleep with somebody else if you are married to the king. And she was beheaded at the age of 19. At her death, she literally announced to the entire audience that she wished that she died the wife of Thomas Culpeper instead of a queen. So she really came out and was like, I wanted to marry someone else. But she did not. So, that happened there. Last wife, Lucky Catherine Parr. She was a humanist and a Protestant, very educated. She wrote a book in the last year of her life, really detailing her ideas on women and humanity. She was able to moderate Henry's hatred of the Protestants, honestly, and she's responsible for making Elizabeth and Edward, the 2 children of Henry VIII, to be more Protestant than Catholic. That way, she really kind of influenced their religious thinking. Obviously, she came in too late to like influence Mary Tudor. I think they were of a similar age, honestly. So Mary remained Catholic, but Edward and Elizabeth both were Protestant because of Catherine Parr. Then we get to the children. Edward VI, I'll keep it short. He was Henry's only legitimate son. I say that because Henry did have a son outside of marriage and could not become king because of it. Edward became king at the age of 9, never married, and died of tuberculosis. Honestly, he was a very devout Protestant and fixated on killing a lot of Catholics. And so, had he actually lived, it really wouldn't have gone well. They probably would have had a civil war. After his death, his sister Mary takes over, and she is very Catholic because of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. She ended up marrying her cousin, Prince Philip or King Philip of Spain. It was not a happy marriage. It was not a good marriage. She was convinced that she was going to have a child and like maintain the line, but she never did. She was known as Bloody Mary because of the people she burned at the stake for their religious preferences, because again, she's trying to return England to the Catholic Church, and it just failed because England by this point is too far into the Protestant Reformation. When she died, she begged her sister Elizabeth to continue her work of uniting with the church. Elizabeth is the final Tudor to rule. She was considered illegitimate because her mother was, executed and accused of being a witch and all that stuff. So at the time, people were like, can she even inherit? But she did have a good amount of loyalty and a good following. She was secretly Protestant, but we can't actually prove it. She really was very private about her religious preferences. She had learned between her father's reign, her brother's reign, and her sister's reign, don't say what you are because that's the best way to stay alive. She was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. She refused to marry, in fact. She was very firm about being married to her country, and she refused to have anyone become king. She was very paranoid about losing her power, and she honestly was better off for it. She ended up strengthening England and made the country a leading force in the world. And because of her, England was in a golden age. They had a strong navy, they were incredibly wealthy, and they were the guiding light of Europe. So hopefully, if you've watched this entire video, you have gotten your answers for the tutor's identification worksheet. If you have figured out what this video is, please do not tell anyone else because I want to see how many people actually watch it. So best of luck, and you do have a quiz on all of this tomorrow.